Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. The thing about working a harbour is that you learn water the way you learn a person you've lived with for a long time. Not just the surface of it, but the behaviour of it, the moods and the tells and the particular way it moves when something is coming that hasn't arrived yet. You stop reading the water consciously after enough years and start reading it the way you read a room when you walk in, before you've identified what specifically feels different, just the immediate and wordless register of whether things are as they should be. The water in Dunmore Harbour started feeling wrong in the second week of September. I'd been harbour master there for 6 years, which made me the newest person to hold the position in about 4 decades, the previous 2 having each served for over 20 years before retiring, or, in one case, simply stopping showing up, which was how the position had come to me rather faster than I'd expected. Dunmore was a working port, small by any commercial standard, servicing maybe 30 active fishing vessels and a handful of private craft, with a fuel dock and a cold storage facility and a harbour master's office that had been built in the 70s and updated minimally since. It sat on the Oregon coast, in the kind of town that the coastal tourist economy had not quite reached, which meant it had stayed functional and unglamorous and largely itself. The first disturbance happened on a Tuesday night, just after midnight. I wasn't there for it. I got the call from one of the dock hands, a young man named Feely who worked the overnight fuel dock, who said that 3 boats on the North Mooring line had shifted simultaneously and that 2 of them had snapped their bowlines, not chafed through, not worked loose, snapped. He said the water around them had been moving in a way he couldn't account for, coming from below rather than from any wind or wake, a single upward displacement that had lifted all 3 hulls at once and then dropped them. I came down and looked at the lines and looked at the water and logged it as an unexplained displacement event, which was the category we used for things that didn't fit any standard explanation and that you didn't want to leave without a record. The water was flat and normal by the time I got there. Feely was calm in the way that young men are calm when they've decided not to fully process something yet. It happened again 2 nights later. This time, 6 boats, the entire North Line, lifted and dropped in that same upward surge, and 2 of them took on enough water from the motion that they needed to be pumped out the following morning. I was there for this one, standing on the dock when it happened, and I can tell you that the sensation of it was not like any wave action or current surge I had encountered in 6 years of working that water. It came from directly below, straight up, uniform across all 6 hulls simultaneously, which is not how water moves when disturbed by anything on the surface or by any tidal or current mechanism I was familiar with. I stood on the dock after it passed and looked at the water, and the water was dark and flat and entirely still, the way it gets in the small hours when there's no wind and no traffic and the harbour is just sitting with itself. And then, about 40 feet off the end of the dock, something broke the surface. Not dramatically, not with any explosion of water or sound, just a slow emergence dark and massive and continuous, the way the back of something surfaces when it is not rushing, just rising, a curved and enormous shape coming up through the black water and then sitting there, just at the surface, for about 8 seconds before it went back down with the same unhurried quality it had come up with. The displacement from it going back under reached the dock as a smooth and steady swell that rocked every boat in the harbour. I stood there for a long time after the water settled. The third incident happened the following night and took out the entire south mooring line. Every vessel on it dragged or broke free, and 2 of them made contact with each other hard enough to cause hull damage. The Coast Guard, out of the district office, had been notified after the second incident, and by the morning after the third, they had issued a harbour closure pending investigation. The official investigation lasted 4 days and produced a conclusion of unexplained seismic microactivity, which was the kind of explanation that was technically possible and practically convenient, and which I did not believe for a moment. The Coast Guard surveyed the harbour bottom with sonar and found nothing anomalous in the survey data, which told me something in itself, though I couldn't have said exactly what. During the closure I stayed on, there was enough administrative work to justify it, and I wasn't ready to leave the water unobserved, which was a feeling I couldn't have defended logically, but which was strong enough that I didn't try. On the second night of the closure, just before 1 in the morning, there was a knock at the harbour master's office door. The man outside was in his late 80s, heavy-framed but still straight in his posture, wearing the kind of worn canvas work coat that fishermen of a certain age wear until it falls apart and then buy the same one again. His name was Aldrich Vane, and he had been fishing out of Dunmore for more than 60 years, which meant he was one of the oldest active commercial fishermen on that stretch of coast, and also meant he had more accumulated knowledge of those waters than anyone I could have consulted. He didn't wait for me to ask why he was there. "You've seen it come up," he said. It was not a question. I told him I had. He came in and sat down in the chair across from the desk and looked at his hands for a moment in the way that people look at their hands when they're deciding where to start. He told me what he knew, which was not everything, but was more than anyone else in Dunmore knew or would admit to knowing. The town had been established in the 1880s by a small group of fishing families who had come down the coast from a settlement further north that had failed. When they arrived at the bay that would become Dunmore, they found it already in use, which was not unusual for coastal sites, except that what they found evidence of was not another human settlement, but a systematic and long-standing series of arrangements that suggested whoever had been there before them had understood something about the bay that they'd been careful to work around. There were markers at the water's edge, long since removed and mostly forgotten, and an accounting of them had been made by the town's first official record keeper, a woman named Pruell, whose ledger had survived in the Historical Society's collection until the collection flooded in the 1960s, and most of it was lost. Aldrich had seen the ledger as a young man and remembered enough of it. The original arrangement, as Pruell had recorded it, was simple. The bay was used by something that had prior claim to it. The terms were these: the water was available for fishing during daylight hours. After midnight, the bay was not to be entered. Boats were to be moored with enough slack that they could rise without restraint. and once per generation, someone from the town was to come to the end of the dock at the water's edge and stand there on the night of the first autumn storm and acknowledge by their presence that the arrangement was understood and ongoing. "When did that stop?" I asked. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "My father's generation was the last to do it," he said. 1941 or thereabouts. The war took most of the young men, and the ones who were left didn't think it was anything more than old superstition. And after the war, everyone was busy being different, and the whole thing just dropped away. He looked at me steadily. Nobody stood at that dock at the right time in over 80 years. "And you think that's why it's surfacing now?" "I think the arrangement lapsed," he said, "and whatever the arrangement was keeping civil has noticed." I went to the harbour records room the following morning, which was a narrow space off the back of the office that held logbooks going back to the town's incorporation. The oldest volumes were in the worst shape, the bindings cracked and the pages brittle, and I went through them carefully, looking for anything that matched what Aldrich had described. I found a reference to the markers in a logbook from 1904, a single entry in the cramped and careful handwriting of whoever had been keeping the log that year, noting the removal of the waterline markers as part of a dock expansion project, and adding, with no further explanation, that the council had voted to discontinue the old observance on the grounds that the town had outgrown the need for it. One line below that, added later in different ink, were 4 words in a different hand, small and cramped and written at an angle as if added quickly. They said, this was a mistake. I sat with that for a while. I went back through every logbook I could access and found 3 more references, each decades apart, each brief, each describing a period of harbour disturbances that had subsided after an unspecified intervention. The most recent was from 1953, a period of 2 weeks in which 11 boats had been damaged or sunk at their moorings before the disturbances stopped. The log entry for the night they stopped said only that the matter had been resolved by traditional means and made no further elaboration. I tried to find what traditional means meant in that context and came up against the edge of what the records contained. Whatever had been done in 1953, whoever had done it, the specifics of it, had not been committed to any document I could find. On the 4th night of the closure, with the harbour sitting dark and empty and the Coast Guard investigation formally concluded, I went down to the end of the dock at midnight. I want to be clear that I had not entirely decided to do this before I did it. I was walking the dock on my usual check, and I reached the end of it, and I stopped, and I stayed stopped. And after a while, I understood that I was going to stand there and see what happened, which was either the most rational response to everything I had learned, or a very poor decision, and possibly both. The night was clear and cold, the kind of early autumn cold that has some winter in it already. The water was black and flat, and the lights from the town behind me reached just far enough to show me the nearest mooring buoys, and then gave out. Everything beyond was dark, in the specific way that deep water is dark at night, not just the absence of light, but the presence of depth beneath it, all that downward distance you can't see, but can feel in the quality of the surface. I stood there for a long time. The cold worked through my jacket, and I kept my eyes on the water, and the water did nothing. Then, about 20 feet off the end of the dock, it came up. It rose the way it had the first time I'd seen it, slowly and without drama, and it was much closer now, and I could see more of it in the ambient light from shore. The scale of it was the first thing that reorganized my understanding of everything I thought I knew about what lived in those waters. What was visible above the surface was only a portion of the whole, and already it was larger than the dock I was standing on, larger than the harbour master's office, a dark and continuous mass that displaced the water around it in a smooth and even swell that I felt in the dock planking under my feet as a low and steady vibration. The surface of it was not what I expected, not scaled or shelled, or any of the things that the thinking part of my brain had been quietly preparing for. It was dark and smooth, with a texture that caught the light from shore in a way that suggested something dense and old, the way very old wood looks, or deep river stone that has been underwater for longer than anyone has been counting. It did not breach fully. It rose to a point of partial emergence and stopped there, and the water around it settled to a stillness that felt chosen rather than natural. And then it oriented towards me. I felt this before I saw any evidence of it. A shift in the quality of being looked at, which is a thing humans can feel even when they can't explain why. That change in the air when attention lands on you from somewhere, then a slow movement in the upper mass of it, a turning, subtle and enormous, bringing some part of itself to face the end of the dock where I was standing. I don't know how long we stayed like that. The cold stopped registering at some point. I was aware of the dock under my feet and the water in front of me and the thing in the water, and nothing much else. It did not communicate in any way I can describe with language. But something happened in that time, in that specific duration of mutual stillness, that felt less like an encounter and more like an accounting, like a ledger being reviewed. Then it went back down. The swell from its descent reached the dock as a clean and even wave that came up over the planking and soaked my boots and then pulled back. The water settled. The harbour was empty and dark and ordinary. I stood there for another few minutes, making sure. Then I went back to the office and sat at the desk for a long time without doing anything in particular. The harbour reopened the following morning. The fishing fleet came back to its moorings over the course of the day, and by afternoon the north and south lines were full, and the fuel dock was running, and Dunmore Harbour looked and functioned exactly as it always had. There were no further disturbances. The boats sat easy in their moorings that night, and the night after, and every night since. I filed my final incident report, which said what the Coast Guard's conclusion had said, which was seismic microactivity, now resolved. I have no plans to amend it. Aldrich came by the office a week after the reopening. He stood in the doorway and looked at me, and I told him I'd gone to the dock and what had happened there, and he listened, without interrupting, and then nodded once in a way that suggested he'd expected something like this. "Did it feel finished?" he asked. I thought about that carefully, about the quality of that long, still moment on the dock, the sense of a ledger being reviewed, tallied, closed. "For now," I said. He nodded again and left. I still work the harbour. The water has been normal in every measurable way since that night, and the fleet has had a good autumn season, and nothing about Dunmore Harbour would suggest to any outside observer that anything unusual had occurred. The Coast Guard closed the harbour and it reopened. These things happen, but I don't go to the end of the dock after midnight anymore. Not because I'm afraid of what I'll find there, more because of the specific quality of that moment on the dock, when the thing in the water turned toward me and held me in whatever passed for its attention, and the feeling it left behind that has not entirely faded. It looked at me the way something looks at a person when it has already made a decision about them, patient and certain, and without any of the uncertainty that human attention carries. Like it had noted something, like it had placed me in a category of its own devising and was satisfied with where I'd landed. I don't know what that category is. Some nights, I almost want to go back to the dock and find out. Those are the nights I stay the furthest from the water.